Alright, in this video we're going to look at saws and sawing. The saw is a tool that you've probably used quite a lot of in woodwork so far, but the course demands that you know a little bit beyond what you've been experienced in the workshop. Okay, let's start with some saw terminology. If you're talking about a saw and describing it and how it can be used and stuff, then we need to be able to describe the parts of it. The saw has a toe end far away from you and a heel end. I don't know who imagined that it would be best described with the parts of feet, but nevertheless there we are. Okay, so we've got a toe end at the front and a heel end at the back. Got a handle obviously that you hold, a back of the saw here and the front of the saw. The front of the saw is where the blade and where the teeth are. And when we're talking about teeth, we need to talk about teeth per inch, because each saw comes with this measurement, TPI, and it's a measurement of how many teeth are in 1 inch of the blade. So you look at the blade and you measure out an inch of it and you count how many teeth are in it. If you've got lots of teeth, if you've got a high TPI, then you get a very, very fine cut from it. If you've got hardly any teeth, you get a low TPI, which gives you a coarse cut, a really ragged, jaggy cut. Okay, so if you want to do a lot of coarse, high volume sawing, you pick a saw with low TPI. If you want to do fine craftsmanship, you'd pick a saw with high TPI. The other thing we need to be aware of when we're talking about sawing is something called the kerf, which is the width of a saw cut, and it is roughly the same as the width of the metal blade in the saw. It's not always the same because the blade does wobble as you saw it, so it tends to be a little bit wider. But the kerf is a significant size. It can be up to a millimetre, which when you're coming to do handmade woodwork joints, that millimetre could be the difference between a nice well-fitting joint and something which is all loose and rattly. So whenever you're doing your measuring and marking out, you have to take into account the width of the blade, the so-called kerf. And the last piece of terminology that we need to use in here is the two types of cuts that we do on wood. Wood has a grain, and if you're cutting along the grain, if your saw, in other words, is travelling down the same direction as the grain, then you're doing what's called a rip cut. However, if you're cutting across the grain this way, then that's what's called a cross cut. And strictly speaking, you should choose a different saw for each job. Some are suitable for ripping and some are suitable for cross cutting, although modern saws tend to be able to do both jobs quite well. Let's take a look at some saws then. First of all, let's take a look at the large saws. Now, we've not used these in school before, but it's conceivable that you may have used these at home before or seen people using them. These are the big saws that you see joiners and carpenters use on big jobs. We've got three types we need to look at. We've got the rip saw, the crosscut saw, and the panel saw. You can see here we've already got saws that are described according to the operation that they're expected to perform. And notice that the TPI changes quite a lot between them. So a rip saw, okay, cutting along the grain, needs a saw with big, chunky, small number of teeth, only 4.5 teeth per inch. Whereas a crosscut saw, and that's for cutting across the grain, needs a TPI of around 8, so it offers a finer, more controllable cut. These days we tend to use these general purpose saws. They can do ripping and cross cutting effectively well. The panel saw has even more teeth per inch, so it has even smaller teeth, and it's up at 10 TPI. Very good at cross cutting is the panel saw as well. So that's your large saws, but in the workshop we tend to use smaller hand-held saws. I'm going to look at 3 of them just now. The first one's the one you've used probably the most, the tenon saw. General purpose woodworking saw. It's really good at doing straight, accurate cuts, and the reason it's good at doing these things is because it has this back stiffener right here. Okay, sometimes made out of brass, but this stiffener ensures that, unlike the panel saw from the previous slide, that the blade doesn't wobble and flop around. So very accurate, 15 teeth per inch, and a very fine cut to it as well. But if you were cutting something that needed curved cuts, circular cuts, arcs and things like that, you would probably choose the coping saw, because this is ideal for cutting curves. And the reason it's good for cutting curves is that the blade is really, really thin. Right? Because it's really thin, that makes the saw really quite manoeuvrable. And you can be, and also you can adjust the angle, so it's quite good at getting into little awkward parts. Look again at the TPI value, 14 to 24. So these are really tiny, tiny fine set teeth. We get a really good quality of cut with a coping saw, but it does take us a long time to do anything. And the third saw I want to show you, not because it's in your course, because it's not really in the course, but it's one that you will have used in the workshop. It's worthy of some explanation. It's called the Gensaw, or the gentleman's saw. Sometimes people call this a fine cut saw. But the Gensaw is a little small version of the tenon saw, and it has even smaller teeth in it. Okay, 20 teeth per inch, and this is for super fine and super accurate straight cuts. Just like the tenon saw, it has a stiff sort of a stiffener across the back here. But you would use this if you were doing really high quality woodwork joints, because it's got a narrow kerf, right, to it, and it produces a really, really fine cut. And that's it as far as saws go. Those are the ones that we need to know. We need to know our large saws and our small saws. I've got an activity for you now. Okay, Matt Esley is a YouTube woodworker, very good, so he is, and he's made a video called How to Saw Correctly, and he goes through all the techniques and all the approaches that you need to do fine sawing work. I'd like you to go ahead and watch that.